Something happened to the Russian army on April 30 that their commanders don't want to admit. Something that wiped out months of preparation, thousands of lives, and the entire belief that this time they would break through the fortress belt, the 50-kilometer steel defensive belt that Ukraine had spent 11 years building. Ukraine didn't just stop an attack. Ukraine had prepared a trap and waited. While thousands of Russian soldiers were fleeing the battlefield, abandoning weapons and leaving behind the wounded, on that same day in Moscow, Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin signed Decree Number 488, banning the import of all foreign satellite communication equipment, including Starlink, effective for 6 months, tasking the FSB and federal customs with immediate enforcement. The Kremlin called it a measure to protect national security. But this is what Moscow isn't telling you. The very soldiers fleeing in Donetsk that day were using Starlink to coordinate drones, communicate between units, and position themselves on the battlefield, and without it, they were left with paper maps and GPS phones. The Kremlin had just cut that lifeline with a single signature, right on the day their army needed it most. 2 events, on the same day, one on the Donetsk battlefield, one in a Moscow meeting room. At first glance, they seem unrelated, but in reality, both are telling exactly the same story. It's not a story about a defeat, not about a wrong decision. This is a story about 3 crises happening simultaneously inside the world's largest military machine: a manpower crisis, an equipment crisis, and a communications crisis, and why they all converged on April 30. Stay with me, because once you understand this, you'll see the ongoing war in a completely different way. To understand why April 30 was so important, you need to understand what the Fortress Belt really is, and why Putin has wanted it for the past 4 years. The Fortress Belt is a 50-kilometer steel corridor running along Highway H20, from Sloviansk and Kramatorsk in the north down to Druskivka and Kostiantynivka in the south, covering an urban area that once had more than 380,000 residents before the war. But it's not the population figure that made it Putin's #1 target on his shopping list. This is what made it that target. Ukraine had spent 11 continuous years since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, turning this belt into one of the most heavily fortified defensive works in the world. Concrete fortifications, multi-layered minefields, anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth, underground shelters, entire industrial zones integrated into the terrain like natural fortresses. Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, the 2 northern gateway cities, are Ukraine's logistics and defense production centers in Donetsk, what analysts call the citadels, places that, even if everything around them collapses, can hold out and continue to sustain the entire front. Controlling the fortress belt isn't just about gaining more territory. Controlling the fortress belt means controlling the entire Donetsk province, achieving the main political objective Putin declared from the first day of the war. That's why Russia was willing to pay any price for it. And the price they paid was very real. In December 2025, after 21 months of bloody assaults, Russia captured Pokrovsk. Putin declared victory. But then something strange happened. 5 months later, Russia still hadn't captured Hryshine, a small village just 2 kilometers from Pokrovsk. The Institute for the Study of War, ESW, confirmed what many analysts had already seen. Russia was committing to a multi-year effort to capture the fortress belt. But even the first steps were proving more costly, slower, and harder than anything they had calculated. The central defensive force facing all those attacks was Ukraine's 11th Corps under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Dmytro Zaporizhzhits. And on the morning of April 30, they had prepared something the Russian side had not anticipated at all. This was not an impulsive Russian attack. That's the important thing to understand from the start. Russian commanders had invested months of preparation, had suffered thousands of casualties in previous probing waves, had expended enormous amounts of ammunition to clear the way. They believed this time they would break through. They advanced on 2 simultaneous attack axes. The first axis targeted Sloviansk, the 3rd Combined Arms Corps, along with the independent motorized brigades 85 and 123, around 4,000 to 5,000 troops, advancing in small waves to infiltrate Ukrainian trenches in the Kostiantynivka-Druskivka tactical area. The second axis aimed straight at Kostiantynivka, Chechen Sever Akhmat, along with the independent motorized Brigade 136, thousands of soldiers with motorcycles and light armored vehicles pressing silently and calculatedly against the Kale Belt. And this is what needs to be understood about Russian tactics this time. They had changed. They had learned from previous failures. No more large tank columns moving in classic formations that Ukrainian drones could detect from afar. Instead, individual soldiers infiltrating separately, positioning with paper maps or preloaded GPS phones, wearing thermal cloaks and camouflage raincoats for night operations. Wave tactics. Attack, pause, then attack again, aimed at grinding down the Ukrainian defense bit by bit. They knew the low plain terrain, forests, and commanding hills were their disadvantage. They had adjusted. They held numerical superiority. And they had no idea what was waiting for them. On the morning of April 30, Ukraine activated its counterattack plan, not by luck, not by immediate reaction, but as the result of weeks of drone reconnaissance and deep intelligence tracking every Russian movement, calculating the exact moment to strike. The Sloviansk axis was broken first. Northeast of Lyman, south of Kadivka village, Ukrainian units appeared right when the Russian attack waves were stalled and losing momentum. Geolocation reports confirmed it all in real time. While Russian military bloggers were celebrating on social media that they had just captured eastern Sloviansk, Ukraine was doing the complete opposite right on the ground. The low plain terrain that Russia thought it had calculated carefully suddenly turned into a death trap. Ukrainian drones and artillery systematically destroyed each stalled attack wave, each disoriented group of soldiers on terrain they thought they knew. The Kostiantynivka axis collapsed simultaneously. Ukraine advanced quickly into the eastern part of the city, recapturing northeastern positions in Stepanivka that Russia had claimed to control after the infiltration on April 29, just one day earlier. Positions that the Russian side was still celebrating controlling suddenly fell back into Ukrainian hands. Then panic spread. Russian soldiers were stunned, not understanding what was happening to them, not understanding why their carefully planned operation was collapsing so quickly. Russia withdrew step by step, then fled en masse. Some ran without looking back, leaving fighting positions abandoned, leaving the wounded behind, leaving equipment scattered across a battlefield they had come to conquer. Ukraine immediately pursued, shifting from the phase of repelling to liberating villages, expanding controlled territory south of Kadivka, and establishing a new defensive line in eastern Kostiantynivka. The fortress belt did not collapse. The Sloviansk gate slammed shut in front of Russian forces. The Kostiantynivka-Druzhkivka corridor remained firmly in Ukrainian hands. This was the first major stumble of the Russian spring offensive. Despite this failure, Putin's commanders still publicly declared that they could continue for 1 or 2 more years. That was not confidence, that was desperation disguised in strategic language. Ukraine did not write the message impregnable on the fortress belt with declarations or press statements. They wrote it with blood, with drones, with every meter of trench held while the Russian side was fleeing. The fate of a war sometimes changes just a few hundred meters south of a small village, and right here at the fortress belt, Ukraine may have just changed the situation in a way that even Putin did not anticipate. But the real question remains, why did an army that had prepared so thoroughly, had learned from previous failures, had adjusted tactics and invested months of preparation fail in this way? The answer is not on the battlefield. It lies inside the Russian military machine, and it is far worse than what you are thinking, because the Fortress Belt battle was not an exception. That is the most important thing you need to understand before we continue. Because if you look at the entire battlefield picture for April 2026 with real data, you will see a repeating trend. In April, Russia captured less than 12% of the territory compared to March, while the number of attack waves increased by an additional 2.2%. Let that number sink in. Russia attacked more and advanced less. Not just a little less, but significantly less, while expending more resources, more ammunition, and more lives. According to deep state data, Donetsk remained the main focus of the entire campaign, accounting for 36% of total advances across the battlefield. But the absolute figure only reached 53 square kilometers, nearly half of March. And to achieve that 53 square kilometers, Russia had to launch an average of 36 separate attack waves for each square kilometer captured, 36 attack waves for 1 square kilometer. to help you visualize what that means in reality. Konstantinovka, the city that is the focus of the entire campaign, spans 66 square kilometers. At the current pace, capturing this city would require Russia to concentrate its entire force on a single point, continuously, without rest for half a month, something that Ukraine's deep defense will never allow to happen. But the most staggering number is not the number of attack waves. It is the blood price Russia is paying for each square kilometer. According to data published by Al Jazeera in April 2026, in the first quarter of this year, Russia lost an average of 316 casualties for each square kilometer captured, 2.6 times higher than the 120 casualties per square kilometer in 2025. The price is not just increasing, it is increasing exponentially. And while Russia is pouring more and more people into Donetsk in exchange for less and less land, they simultaneously have to stretch their forces thin across the entire battlefield. In April, 30% of total advances took place in Sumy, 22% in Kharkiv, 12% in Zaporizhia. Russia is attacking on all directions at once, but achieving no meaningful breakthrough anywhere. This is the direct consequence of a mistaken strategic decision. After capturing Pokrovsk in December 2025, after 21 months of bloodshed, Russia could not exploit that success. Kryskine, a small village just 2 kilometers from Pokrovsk, remained uncaptured after 5 months. And to continue pressuring Konstantinovka, Russia was forced to pull troops from other directions, weakening defenses across the entire front line, and Ukraine is counterattacking by exploiting exactly those gaps. On April 19th, just in the Belitska-Radinska-Rishine area, Russia launched 42 attack waves in a single day. None succeeded. While Russia is attacking more and advancing less, Ukraine is doing the complete opposite. President Zelensky announced that Ukraine has recaptured 460 square kilometers since the beginning of 2026. March 2026 was the month Ukraine recaptured more territory than the total amount lost since the summer of 2023, a milestone unprecedented throughout the entire war. In Dnipropetrovsk, the occupied area decreased from 187 square kilometers to 98 square kilometers. Ukraine recaptured 89 square kilometers in just 3 months. And this is the number that shows the battlefield nature has completely changed. In March 2026, Russia lost 35,351 troops, the highest record in the entire war, up 29% from February. Drones caused 96% of those total casualties. Artillery and infantry accounted for the rest. What does that mean? It means this is no longer a war of artillery and tanks. This is a drone war, and in that war, the balance is clearly tilting to one side. But this is also not symmetric stalemate, even though many still describe it that way. Symmetric stalemate means neither side can advance. What is happening here is entirely different. One side is paying an increasingly higher price for every square meter and becoming more exhausted, while the other side is recapturing territory and stabilizing its defensive lines. Each Russian attack wave, more people, more ammunition, more equipment, but less territory. The gap between the price paid and the results achieved is widening every month. So the real question is why? Why is an army attacking more, advancing less? Why is the price increasing exponentially while the results are decreasing? The answer lies in the 3 crises that are simultaneously eroding the Russian military machine from within. And the first crisis, the worst crisis, is what the Kremlin is trying to hide at all costs. Because the first crisis is manpower, and the real numbers behind it are far worse than what the Kremlin wants you to know. According to NATO data, Russia's total casualties since the beginning of the war have reached 1.3 million people. Just 2025 alone saw 400,000, meaning more than 1,000 people per day is completely normal. But even that figure has been surpassed. March 2026 broke the record. 35,351 casualties in just 1 month, up 29% from February, according to figures published by Al Jazeera on April 10. General Pavlo Palisa, deputy head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, confirmed the figure of 316 casualties for each square kilometer captured in the first quarter of 2026, 2.6 times higher than last year. And if you think those official numbers fully reflect reality, look at the leaked data from the Russian Ministry of Finance. In the first quarter of 2026, the Kremlin paid compensation to the families of 25,000 killed soldiers, compared to 20,000 in the same period of 2025 and only 10,000 in the same period of 2024. The rate of deaths has increased 2.5 times in just 2 years. In just the past 2 weeks, more than 4,600 new names were added to the casualty list, and a large portion of them were those previously listed as missing since 2024, meaning even the numbers being released today are still lower than reality. The two republics of Bashkortostan and Tatarstan have exceeded the total casualties of the Soviet Union in 10 years of the Afghanistan war, surpassing it by 20%, with 18,116 confirmed cases. But even that is not the real number. Independent analysts estimate that the field monitoring and public reporting system only records 45 to 65% of actual total casualties. The rest disappear in silence, because Ukrainian drones prevent the recovery of bodies from the battlefield, and some casualties will never be officially recorded. General Pivnenko, commander of the Ukrainian National Guard, said bluntly, "They advance very slowly and suffer enormous losses. For them, 1,000 casualties a day is normal, but the scale of casualties is only half the story. The other half is the question of who is really bearing those losses, and the answer is the darkest face of this war. Men from the poor republics of Tuva, Buryatia, and Altai have a probability of appearing on the casualty list 20 to 30 times higher than residents of Moscow. Contracts are signed in small towns, villages with no stable jobs, where military bonuses are the only way out that many families can think of. Buryatia is the most typical example. At the beginning of 2025, this republic seemed to have escaped the top 10 regions with the highest casualties. But then local authorities increased bonuses in April, and Buryatia returned to 8th place. This is a vicious cycle with no escape. Poverty leads to signing contracts leads to death creates recruitment pressure leads to higher bonuses, and higher bonuses pull more poor people into that spiral. Meanwhile, wealthy families in Moscow watch the war on TV. The sons of poor families in Siberia and the Caucasus are dying in the killing fields of Donetsk. This is inequality and the duty to die, and this is the darkest face of Putin's war. To understand why this situation continues, you need to understand why Putin does not declare full mobilization and the price he is paying for that decision. In 2022, the partial mobilization created enormous social trauma. Hundreds of thousands of Russian men fled abroad, lines of cars at the borders, and that image still haunts the Kremlin to this day. Putin does not want that scenario repeated. Instead, he chose the path of voluntary contracts combined with astronomical bonuses. The federal level is 400,000 rubles, some regions pushing one-time bonuses up to 3 to 5 million rubles. At the end of 2025, when the situation seemed to ease, the Kremlin tried to reduce bonuses. Then casualties continued to escalate, and they had to increase them again. ISW recorded at least 12 federal regions that increased bonuses by 50 to 80% since mid-February 2026. The result is that bonus inflation is draining regional budgets, with a total deficit of about $9 billion, to the point where some regions have cut compensation payments to families of killed soldiers, while others still have to increase them to attract people. At the same time, the Kremlin is carrying out what they call voluntary mobilization, but is actually systematic coercion. Employees at workplaces are pressured to volunteer, university students are pressured, conscripts are forced to sign contracts, and illegal arrests are used as a recruitment tool. According to the Moscow Times, these actions are becoming systematic in 2026, no longer exceptions but unofficial policy. The ultimate goal is to expand the army to 1.5 million active troops. The quantity can be partially achieved, but quality cannot be bought with bonuses, and this is the core issue that is collapsing the entire Russian combat machine. In 2026, 57% of new contract soldiers come from prisons or low-income regions. The proportion from what Ukrainian agencies call vulnerable groups, including prisoners and heavy debtors lured with amnesty or debt cancellation, has risen to about 40%. Properly trained officers are increasingly scarce, leading to a lack of capacity to execute complex combined arms tactics. Training time has been drastically shortened. Some units reach the front after only a few weeks of basic training. But worse still, there are reports of wounded soldiers being sent straight back into combat without recovering, and surrenders being actively prevented by commanders. The direct consequence is visible right on the battlefield: the individual infiltration tactics at Kostiantynivka using paper maps and GPS phones that we mentioned earlier. That is not tactical creativity. That is the clearest evidence of an army lacking properly trained manpower. And when those soldiers reach the front, facing experienced Ukrainian units equipped with drones, the inevitable happened: morale collapse, not by chance, but by necessity. These realities are becoming increasingly widely known inside Russia and are reducing willingness to sign contracts month by month. The fear of drones is no longer limited to the front lines. Russian units are facing drone threats even at assembly points and in the rear, making every movement dangerous and frontline rotation increasingly difficult. Foreign soldiers are also not a solution. More than 27,000 have been recruited since 2022, with a 2026 target of an additional 18,500, but they are poorly trained, lack motivation, and suffer high casualties. Migrants are coerced with threats of visa denial and arrest, lured with promises of citizenship and debt cancellation. The shortage of capable troops remains unresolved, and the recruitment numbers are telling the whole story. The Kremlin set a target of 409,000 new recruits in 2026, aiming for a rate of 1,100 to 1,150 people per day. In reality, the first quarter only reached 940 people per day, totaling 80,456 people, while casualties in the same period exceeded 85,000. Russia is losing more than it gains, and that gap is widening every month. A Ukrainian official bluntly warned LBC, if the recruitment rate drops to 25,000 people per month, Russia will no longer be able to maintain numerical superiority on the battlefield. The conclusion of all this is one: the Russian army is becoming slower, lower quality, and more expensive, a little each month, steadily and irreversibly. But the manpower crisis is only the beginning. The second crisis is happening right on the battlefield, and it is directly related to the images we saw at the fortress belt. The second crisis is about what they are relying on to fight. And to understand why those small wave attacks of Russia at the fortress belt were systematically destroyed by Ukrainian drones like that, you need to look at what is really happening with the equipment stock of the world's largest army. Russian tanks and armored vehicles are literally running out, not as a metaphor, literally. What is being sent to the front now are T-62s and BMP-1s, vehicles produced in the Soviet era, hastily modernized in repair workshops, and pushed straight into the Donetsk battlefield. They do not last a few minutes against modern Ukrainian anti-tank drones, not a few hours, a few minutes, and Russia's new production capacity cannot keep up with the rate of losses occurring on the battlefield. Why can't they compensate faster? The answer lies in a system crumbling from multiple sides at once. International sanctions have cut off the ability to purchase critical components from outside, microchips, sensors, and control systems that the Russian defense industry cannot produce enough of on its own. The skilled labor shortage has reached 4.8 million people. Factories have to meet both civilian demand and military orders, running at maximum capacity, but with increasingly low efficiency because there are not enough skilled workers to operate the production lines. This is not a problem that can be solved with a new policy or additional budget. This is the accumulated consequence of many years, and there are no shortcuts out. So Russia did the only thing they could do. They replaced tanks with cheaper and more abundant things: motorcycles, ATVs, golf carts. That is not creative tactics. That is a sign of desperation. And the consequence is what you saw at the fortress belt and across the Donetsk front line: motorcycle and ATV attacks systematically wiped out by Ukrainian FPV drones, vehicle by vehicle, before they could get close enough to the defensive lines to create any meaningful pressure. Russia has no other choice, and that is exactly what makes the situation particularly dangerous for them. But the equipment crisis is only half of the equation. The other half is what is happening to the fighting spirit of those sitting on those motorcycles and ATVs, and it is directly related to drones. The fear of drones is spreading exponentially in Russian ranks, and this is the important thing to understand, that fear is no longer limited to the front lines. Russian units are facing drone threats right at assembly points, right in rear areas they thought were safe. Every movement, whether advancing forward or withdrawing backward, carries the risk of being tracked and destroyed by an FPV drone. Data from NV Ukraine in April 2026 shows how far Ukrainian drone dominance has reached. In the Pokrovsk area, the 12th Azov Brigade used FPV drones to achieve confirmed kills at distances over 40 kilometers, after operator teams carefully analyzed Russian jamming frequencies, weather conditions, and optimal flight paths. And the result of that is reflected most clearly in a single day. On April 19th, Russia launched 42 attack waves in the Bilyapska-Radinska-Hershine area. None succeeded. 42 attack waves, not a single meaningful result. The direct consequence for Russian mobility is impossible to hide. Units do not dare move during the day because drones can see everything. At night, they lose communication due to the lack of Starlink, and this is exactly the bridge leading to the third crisis, the crisis that in my view is the greatest and cruelest irony of this entire war. Because the third crisis is not about what Russia does not have, but about what they once had, depended on, and then cut off with their own signature on April 30. But before talking about the third crisis, let me ask you a question. In modern warfare, what is the backbone of all combat operations? It is not tanks, it is not artillery shells, it is not troop numbers. It is communication. The ability to coordinate drones in real time, to direct artillery fire precisely to every coordinate, to connect units across a battlefield hundreds of kilometers wide, and to receive intelligence fast enough to act before the situation changes. Without communication, everything else is meaningless. Russia knows this, and this is how they solve that problem, in a way that if you fully understand, you will see this is the greatest and cruelest irony of this entire war. Russia solved the battlefield communication problem by using Starlink, the satellite system of SpaceX, the company founded by Elon Musk, the American billionaire, a citizen of the largest geopolitical rival that the Kremlin is facing. Starlink has never been officially sold in Russia, but since 2024, terminals have been smuggled in through third countries, registered through proxies in other nations, and Russian soldiers have used them to access the internet at the front lines and transmit drone videos back to command centers. By the end of 2025, this dependence had escalated to the point where it could no longer be hidden. Starlink antennas were mounted directly onto Russian attack drones, allowing them to target at distances over 80 kilometers behind Ukrainian lines. This is exactly what forced SpaceX and Ukraine to act, and their actions changed the battlefield in a way no one in Moscow anticipated. On February 1, 2026, SpaceX and Ukraine reached an agreement to disable all Starlink terminals operating in Ukraine that were not registered with Delta, Ukraine's military communications platform, or DIA, the main official civilian portal. Not only that, terminals would also be automatically deactivated if detected moving faster than 90 kilometers per hour to prevent them from being attached to attacking drones in flight. Elon Musk confirmed on February 1 the measures against unauthorized Russian use of Starlink seemed to be working, and that result was seen immediately on the battlefield. Drone video streams were cut off. Small units lost contact with each other. Soldiers had to use GPS phones and paper maps for positioning. This detail appearing in battlefield reports was not coincidental. It was a directly measurable consequence of losing satellite communications. Network traffic on the Ukrainian side recorded a 75% drop, but this was actually Russian traffic using terminals registered under Ukrainian addresses, and now those terminals were dead. The measurable result was not just statistics. This communication loss directly contributed to Ukraine recapturing hundreds of square kilometers in Zaporizhia and Donetsk in the subsequent period. The link between loss of communication and loss of territory is direct, quantifiable, and undeniable. And then on April 30, the Kremlin did something that even the most seasoned military analysts had to stop and look at twice. On the same day that thousands of Russian soldiers were fleeing the fortress belt, On the same day that their army needed communication more than ever, Prime Minister Mishustin signed Decree 488, an order banning the import of all foreign satellite communication equipment into Russia, effective immediately for a period of 6 months, tasking the FSB and federal customs with enforcement, on paper, protecting national security. On the ground, self-severing the communication system that tens of thousands of soldiers depended on to survive and fight. The FSB and customs began tightening. The black market is being strangled slowly but surely. Existing terminals at the front, once broken, will not be replaced. Russia tries to circumvent by using terminals registered through recruited Ukrainian and EU citizens by intelligence, but the import ban is gradually closing the remaining loopholes. And the broader context of this decision makes it even more alarming. Since May 2025, Russia has continuously shut down mobile internet nationwide, citing the need to prevent Ukrainian drones. According to Top 10 VPN, 2025 recorded a total of 37,166 hours of accumulated network outages, affecting nearly the entire Russian population. A digital iron curtain is being erected, and the first to pay the price are not the people inside the country, but the soldiers at the front lines who need information to survive. The Kremlin says national security, soldiers pay with communication. The alternative that Moscow is betting on is the Razvet satellite constellation, but this is not a fair race by any measure. Razvet currently has 16 satellites launched in March 2026, passing over Ukraine only a few times each day, with total connection time not exceeding a few hours. Russia also has GONETS, a satellite system from the 1990s, but data transmission speeds are so slow that it can only send short text messages, useless for real-time drone coordination. Gazprom Space Systems uses high-orbit geostationary satellites. Signals arrive much slower than Starlink due to the greater physical distance. Meanwhile, Starlink is operating more than 9,000 satellites, providing continuous coverage 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This gap cannot be closed in a few months. It cannot be closed in a few years. It requires thousands of satellites and years of continuous launches to achieve comparable coverage, and throughout that entire time, Russian drone combat capability will continue to decline week by week. Russian military blogs, often the most realistic source of information about what is happening on the battlefield, have openly admitted that loss of coordination, slower drone operations, and reduced artillery accuracy are chronic problems, directly and continuously affecting the pace of attacks along the entire Pokrovsk-Sloviansk line. And all of this brings us back to the image I want you to keep in mind. A sergeant in a battalion at Kostiantynivka using a preloaded GPS phone and a sheet of paper map to try to determine where he is standing on the battlefield. That is not the image of an army winning. That is the most specific and real image of what is happening when 3 crises, manpower, equipment, and communication converge at the same time at the same point. When there are no real-time coordinated drones, no precisely directed artillery fire, no inter-unit connections to know where comrades are, the wave attrition tactics that Russia had carefully prepared are no longer tactics, they become suicide traps. And on the same day those soldiers were fleeing the fortress belt, Moscow signed an order ensuring that this situation would not improve, but would get worse, week by week, month by month, until the ban expires, or until Razvet has enough satellites to replace it, something that could take many years. This is the perfect irony of this war. Russia is partly defeated by its dependence on the technology of its own geopolitical rival, and then cut that lifeline with its own hand when it was too late to change anything. While Russia is cutting off its own communications system, Ukraine is doing the complete opposite. Let's start with communications infrastructure. Ukraine has installed 4,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable behind the defensive lines in the Sumy region. Physical fiber optic communication is completely immune to Russian electronic warfare. It cannot be jammed, cannot be blocked, and cannot be disabled by a decree from Moscow or a decision from a billionaire in California. This is the most concrete manifestation of the robotized battlefield vision initiated by former Commander-in-Chief Zaluzhny, and it is beginning to deliver measurable results in 2026. The control range of fiber optic FPV drones has increased from 10 to 20 kilometers in April 2025 to 40 kilometers by early 2026. The control distance has doubled in less than a year, according to data from DroneXL and the Financial Times. While Russia is losing satellite communications day by day, with terminals breaking down one by one without replacements, Ukraine is building a communications network that no external force can cut off with a single signature. But communications infrastructure is only the foundation. What Ukraine is building on that foundation is what is truly changing the nature of this war. In March 2026, Ukrainian FPV drones caused 96% of total Russian casualties, not artillery, not infantry, not missiles, 96%. Defense Minister Fedorov confirmed, "These are clearly confirmed losses. We have video footage of every attack in the system. Drones are no longer support weapons. Drones are the main weapon of 2026 warfare, and Ukraine is not stopping there." In the first half of 2026, Ukraine is signing contracts for 25,000 ground robots, UGVs, more than double the total of all of 2025. In Pokrovsk and Mirnorod, the two cities at the center of the entire Donetsk campaign, UGVs have handled 90% of all frontline logistics, according to a BBC report from November 2025. Not part of logistics, 90%. That means 9 out of 10 supply runs to the front lines do not require a single soldier to risk their life on roads tracked by Russian drones. Robots are not just transporting, they are fighting. The NC-13 unit, the first fully robotic assault unit in modern military history, carried out a completely robotic operation to capture positions in Kursk Oblast in the summer of 2025, with not a single soldier setting foot in the danger zone. In Kostiantynivka, explosive-equipped robots destroyed anti-tank ditch crossings that Russia used to advance. Not infantry, not artillery, but a robot under $20,000 accomplished that. Compare that number with tens of millions of dollars for a crude tank. A tank needs fuel, needs maintenance, needs people inside willing to die, and still cannot last a few minutes against modern anti-tank drones. UGVs are harder to detect than trucks, harder to jam than aerial drones, and require no crew to risk their lives. The Ukrainian General Staff confirmed, integrating robots into combat has reduced Ukrainian casualties by 30% in units that have deployed this system. And while all of this is happening, Ukraine's Starlink continues to operate stably, unthreatened by any decree from outside. The result is the clearest contrasting picture you can draw of two armies fighting on the same battlefield. One side directing fire with real-time drone imagery, coordinating UGVs via jam-proof fiber optics, and reducing casualties with robots. The other side using paper maps and GPS phones for positioning, attacking with motorcycles and ATVs against defensive lines covered by FPV drones for 40 kilometers around. The era of large tank attacks and breakthrough operations in the World War II style has ended on this battlefield. Not because someone declared it over, but because battlefield reality has made it impossible. 2026 warfare is shaped by drones, ground robots, and surgical interventions by small units guided by real-time intelligence. And in that type of war, Ukraine's three pillars of advantage, technology, rapid adaptability, and continuous support from the West, are steadily eroding Russia's brute force every day, every week, every month. Ukraine's advantage in this type of war is not decreasing, it is increasing. And that leads us to the final question everyone wants to know. So what will happen next? So what will happen next? This is the question everyone wants a clear answer to, and I will give you the real answer. First, let's talk about what Russia cannot reverse in the short term. The recruitment target of 409,000 new soldiers in 2026 is failing in a way that no policy in the Kremlin's hands can quickly fix. The first quarter only reached 80,456 people, while casualties in the same period exceeded 85,000, a gap of 65,000 people per year if this trend holds. And there is no sign that the trend is changing for the better for Moscow. Razvet and Gonets cannot replace Starlink for many years to come, which means throughout that entire time, Russian drone combat capability will continue to decline week by week, month by month, while Ukraine continues to expand its fiber optic drone control range and increase the number of UGVs on the battlefield. The Soviet-era equipment stock has physical limits. it cannot be produced fast enough to compensate for the rate of losses, with sanctions still in full effect, and a shortage of 4.8 million skilled workers still without a solution. And the blood price is increasing exponentially rather than linearly. 316 casualties per square kilometer in the first quarter of 2026, compared to 120 in the same period last year, 2.6 times higher in just 1 year. But this is the part many analysts overlook, and overlooking it leads to seriously mistaken forecasts. Russia is not a system on the verge of immediate collapse. Russia can still sustain a war of attrition for a long time. Astronomical bonuses are still attracting people, only with lower quality and higher cost each month. Russia is not bankrupt. Revenue from energy exports amid global instability is still providing enough budget to maintain the war machine, according to assessments by Ukrainian officials with LBC. Full mobilization remains the final card the Kremlin has not played, a card powerful enough to immediately change the numerical equation, albeit at enormous domestic political cost. Domestic political pressure has not yet reached the level that forces Putin to change his basic strategy. This is not sudden collapse. This is structural decline, slow, cumulative, and sustained, like water eroding stone, not visible day by day, but irreversible over time. So the real question is not whether Russia will lose. The real question is how long and at what cost, for both sides, not just one. Look at what is happening every week on this battlefield. Every week. An additional approximately 7,000 recorded Russian casualties, and remember the real number is 35 to 55% higher than recorded. Every week, a few dozen square kilometers changing hands in both directions. More broken Starlink terminals on the Russian front without replacements. More new soldiers from prisons or low-income regions, trained for a few weeks, then pushed out to face 25,000 Zions, tens of thousands of Ukrainian FPV drones. That is the loop happening every week, without exception, with no sign of stopping. Losing 1,000 people per day for another year or two to gain a few hundred square kilometers of territory in Donetsk. That is not the victory Putin promised the Russian people when he started this war. That is not a result worthy of the price being paid. That is a grinder, and it is Russia itself being ground in it, day by day, steadily and irreversibly, while those who ordered the operation of that machine sit safely in Moscow. Now, look back at April 30. 2 events on the same day. On the Donetsk battlefield, thousands of Russian soldiers fled the fortress belt, abandoning weapons, abandoning the wounded, stunned by a failure they did not understand why it happened. In a Moscow meeting room, Prime Minister Mishustin signed Decree 488, cutting off the communication system that the very soldiers fleeing depended on to survive. At first glance, those 2 events seem unrelated. But after everything we have just gone through, you see clearly that they are telling exactly the same story. The fortress belt was not a simple tactical victory. It is the most tangible cumulative evidence of the 3 crises occurring simultaneously inside the Russian military machine. A manpower crisis, with 57% of new soldiers coming from prisons or poor regions, trained for a few weeks, then pushed out to face Ukrainian drones. An equipment crisis, with T-62s and golf carts replacing tanks on the modern battlefield. And a communications crisis, with soldiers using paper maps and GPS phones for positioning, while Ukraine directs with real-time drone imagery through 4,000 kilometers of jam-proof fiber optics. And the Starlink ban is not merely a policy decision. It is the clearest proof of what is really happening inside the Kremlin, a system that prioritizes political image over the actual combat capability of its own forces, willing to cut off its own army's communication system in exchange for a statement that sounds good in internal meetings. The result of all this is numbers that cannot be interpreted positively for Moscow. Russia is attacking more, advancing less, and paying 316 casualties for each square kilometer captured, 2.6 times higher than 120 casualties in the same period last year. The price is not just increasing, it is increasing exponentially. Putin's Donetsk dream has been stuck on paper for 4 years. And with each failed attack like the fortress belt, each soldier lost in human wave attacks destroyed by FPV drones, each broken Starlink terminal on the front without a replacement, that paper is tearing gradually, corner by corner, steadily and irreparably. If you want to continue following analyses like this, Not simple headlines, but what is really happening behind them, why it happens, and what it means. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications right now. And leave a comment below. What do you think will happen next with Russia on the Donetsk battlefield? I read all comments, and your responses will shape our next videos.